Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Temple-West. I am a journalist at the Financial Times. I cover sustainability issues, and I'm happy to have everybody here today for our morning panels, and I'd like to get started. I believe we have one person joining on Zoom, if that's correct. But first, I'd like to introduce Damilola Ogunbiyi, who is head of Sustainable Energy for All. And next to her is Martin Kimani, the ambassador to Kenya. We're going to be talking a little bit about the challenges around food, fuel, and finance. Damilola, I wanted to see if you could just start by talking a little bit about your role at Sustainable Energy for All. What does that look like? What does sort of the day job involve?
Okay, so thank you for having me to start. The job is really about achieving SDG 7, so that's kind of affordable, sustainable energy for everybody. People mistake energy for just electricity, but it's also clean cooking. It's also raising the amount of renewable energy we actually use. So I have a dual role. I have the role of the head of Sustainable Energy for All, but I also have a role at the UN in terms of being the special representative to make sure that Sustainable Development Goal 7 happens. And why it's so important is that to achieve pretty much all the other sustainable development goals, you need energy, you need electricity. So every day we advocate for possibly about 733 million people that have no access to electricity, who can't be on Zoom calls or be here with us today. But even more staggering, 2.4 billion people with no access to clean cooking, which kills probably about 4 million women a year. So it's not a good position to be in. And we just keep on emphasizing the need that to achieve even our climate goals, we cannot do that if we leave people behind.
Great. And Martin, if you have some opening thoughts on the food, fuel, and finance issues, how are you thinking about that in your role and representation of Kenya?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and good morning to everybody. I think it's a really simple answer, and that's which is that my job is to find every way that the UN can offer solutions and relief to Kenyan people and to citizens all over the world who are suffering from a number of crises that have all come together at the same time, contributing to a rapid deterioration in quality of life, in livelihoods, in the affordability of life. I think I saw on the advertisement for this meeting the phrase, the greatest cost of living increase in a generation. That phrase evokes so much, there's so much suffering going on in Kenya and elsewhere, and I think the multilateral system needs to respond far more robustly than is the case. And so we need ideas, but even beyond those ideas, which are always plentiful, we need the will and the determination to push them through. This is the time I think the UN is going to demonstrate to the world, and at least to Kenyan citizens, whether it really is fit for purpose.
Thank you, Martin. And David, I'll introduce you, David Nabarro, co-director of the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. Similar question to you, David. How do you see these challenges in your day-to-day job for fuel, food, and finance? I believe David is muted. David, can we try one more time? Shall we? No, okay. Damilola, just wanted to return to you as we're getting David's audio fixed. How can, have some of the challenges here. How can the UN help facilitate some of these solutions? We're coming up on the General Assembly next week. How are you thinking about how the UN can catalyze its role in addressing some of these challenges?
Well, like the Kenyan ambassador said, it's all about delivery on ground now. It's not about talking about what to do. It has to actually be about impact. There are two things that the UN has done. Last year, there was actually a high-level dialogue on energy, and that was the first time in 40 years. And you have to really put that in context because we have numerous climate conferences every single year, but it was the first time in 40 years that we all sat down as a global community and said, what are we going to do? So one of the key deliverables that came out of that were energy compacts, where companies, countries, NGOs had to come together and say, what am I going to do to achieve SDG 7 by 2030?
Yes.
So this wasn't a 2050 target, it was a 2030. And a couple of days, there will be the report of that progress. One of the key parts that we were pushing was finance on ground, obviously. There were a lot of pledges made, but how do you actually get the funding to the countries that need them? In my previous role, I was head of the Rural Electrification Agency for Nigeria.
Yeah.
And, you know, that context, you have to provide power for 90 million people. And I went through a World Bank, program, and I went through an AFDB program. And it typically takes between 2 and 5 years to get across any of those programs that are meant to help you at warp speed to achieve your targets. So that's a very, very key part of it. The other part that we're doing recently with David as well, actually, is the Global Crisis Response Group, which the SG put together on food, fuel, and energy. So I co-chair the energy piece, and we've just come up with a set of recommendations now. Again, looking at the disbursement rates of DFIs, I'm not sure if people know, but barely about 37% of money that's been allocated for energy projects has actually been disbursed. So there's probably a few, like 20 or 25 billion that is kind of sitting with the banks that can be dispersed quickly, and understanding what those bottlenecks are, if it's the country level interventions or the UN interventions has to come into play. And another thing that we are seriously taking into consideration now is the voluntary carbon market, especially for the African continent. And Africa, who is probably about 2% of the current carbon market, could really benefit for that. And then finally, this narrative of energy access here and energy transition over there really has to change. And what we have been saying is that energy access for many countries is the energy transition. It was actually quite sad. I was in Kigali a few months ago, and I was talking to a bunch of young people, and they were like, can we transition to energy first before you tell us to transition into something else? And that really struck me. We laughed for a bit, but the truth of the matter is, if you still have a continent, at least sub-Saharan Africa, that has 81 gigawatts for 1 billion people, that means just the fact that you're born Black African, you're 20 times at a disadvantage than any other human being on Earth. It's actually quite shocking when you look at some of these stats, and those are the people even with energy. So when we do talk about, multiple crises at the same time, we do have to consider this. While it's very, very important for us to obviously support what is happening with the war, the fact that aid budgets are being cut for really critical areas is also a problem, and that's our real focus at the UN right now, and sustainable energy for all.
Can I follow up with you on something you said about the bottlenecks? Are there any strategies, tools that you are thinking about, hopefully excited about, in the months ahead to unlock that capital?
I mean, there are two programs we're quite excited about. I guess first is not even a program. I think one of the things I've noticed in my last couple of years at the UN is just the power of the UN, the power of certain people to just pick up the phone and call another person, and certain things are unlocked. It's quite remarkable. I've never seen anything like that before. But the other one is, we are working very strongly with a group called the Global Alliance for People and Planet, which is born out of the Rockefeller Foundation,
Okay.
IKEA Foundation, and also the Bezos Earth Fund, who's bringing a lot of philanthropic money into the space to help de-risk. And they're also supporting the DFIs as well, because, all roads do come back to the DFIs and MDBs at the end of the day, but also supporting countries to make sure that they're well equipped. So, for example, with the Just Energy Transition Program in South Africa, having a team work with the South African government on how to actually deliver them that are actually South Africans are actually really important. And they're doing the same thing in Nigeria and I believe Vietnam. So I think all that type of intervention and innovation is very key in the space, knowing that we have, at least for SDG 7, 7 years to go.
And just briefly for folks in the audience who might not know the acronyms, IFI?
Sorry.
That's okay.
DFI, Development Finance Institution, basically the World Bank.
Right. And NDBs?
MDBs, Multilateral Development Bank.
Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah, so AFDB, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, people like that.
Martin, a similar question to you. Are there examples that you are excited about how capital can be unlocked for these these projects?
Well, you have to begin with the fact that there is a great deal of debt that the poorest countries and regions have accumulated over the last decade. And this is partly cyclical. After the financial crisis in 2008, then there were countries that then came back to the capital markets and started accumulating debt to invest in various national projects, whether it's energy or infrastructure. And that has reduced the amount of fiscal space many governments have. So I think the immediate priority is how countries, and especially the most vulnerable, can have more assistance in how they will deal with their fiscal space. And of course, there is a debt process within the IMF and the Paris Club, and China has joined. I think, what is it called?
Is it the Debt for Climate Swap?
No, there's a debt framework.
Okay.
There's a G20 debt framework that China has joined, and now has started restructuring debt to certain African countries. So that's going to need to happen. There are some that will, at the most fragile, may need forms of debt forgiveness, but others that are perhaps even more robust economically will need debt restructuring just to ensure that they have the fiscal space to get through this particular crisis. I think there's an appetite to do that, but there's insufficient speed. And what a lot of policymakers tend to do, we're much better at solving emergencies than preventing them. And so I think at this point, we are in an emergency, but in one of these almost slow-moving emergencies, because the experiences of people on the ground sometimes do not urgently enough touch our debates here in the UN. There's something very distant about how distant we are from the situation on the ground. So debt restructuring is one. Then there are commitments that have been made over time. For example, in dealing with the climate crisis, I think we should no longer call it climate change. We should just call it the climate crisis, which is having very apparent and dangerous effects globally, from Pakistan to the Horn of Africa.
Right.
We're going to need to do two things at the same time. One is a just transition of energy. But beyond pointing fingers at one another, there's a great deal of practical work that is needed to help governments cope at this specific time. We're going to need an entire generation of innovators from plant science all the way across the sciences and in different processes within government, just to enable states to begin to have the capabilities to at least mitigate the worst effects, even as they build up a more robust response. The UN has unique capabilities. I have found myself very impressed by the humanitarian capabilities of the UN. Of course, there are limits to them, but there's a lot the UN is experienced and good at doing that can be brought to use right now. And I think, so it becomes not creating necessarily new instruments. Some of those may be needed, of course, but about using the ones we have more effectively. And I hope the leaders who are coming here next week really concentrate that message of, one, uplifting the UN, but at the same time, trying to encourage and push for more implementation of of the instruments we have. The World Bank, the IMF, they have the instruments, but their pace of implementation is far too slow.
And is that, I mean, I couldn't help but notice you were active on Twitter this morning, calling for the need for stronger multilateral responses. And these are some of the examples that you're thinking of for that. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, as long as multilateralism has existed, at least in the last century, there's always been complaints about its inadequacy.
Right.
But at this stage, I think we have entered a new chapter of reconsidering our entire framework. And it's the same thing I said before. We're being tested. More than ever before, Kenyan citizens and other citizens are asking, these institutions, are they sufficient for us? Are they going to do the job? And I think that's the challenge before us. But I also wanted to say something very quickly. Sorry. Beyond the immediate emergency, I find myself quite puzzled about what the future portends. The conflicts that are going on, whether it's Ukraine or the conflicts between the major powers, are leading to a fundamental reshaping of the global economy. So the way the sanctions and the blockades, the weaponization of food and fertilizer, the way they're all working is changing what we broadly call the globalization model. And countries like my own and other countries had committed themselves and tried to align themselves to develop sustainably through globalization. A lot of those doors are not necessarily closed, but they've shifted, right? And so what is going to be the engine of growth, the engine of job creation? How are the export markets going to look when there is such fundamental change due to the conflict between the major powers? So it seems to me that the war in Ukraine and its implications in terms of how the major powers relate to each other are going to be felt by all of us for a long time to come.
Definitely. Damilola, on a more positive note, I noticed you've been active on Twitter, and can you talk a little bit about the electricity project in Madagascar? You mentioned that it was opening opportunities for learning. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might be an example of a positive solution?
Yes, one of the things that, and especially when I took over this role, is how do you have delivery of direct impact on ground? So there's a program we run called the Universal Energy Facility, which is a results-based financing facility, and this is how it works. When companies connect remote villages or communities to solar power, either through solar mini grids or solar standalone systems for productive use, and they see it's working and it's all metered and they're collecting money, we provide a subsidy. And what that subsidy does is kind of like that viability gap, because it's not just about providing people power, it also has to be affordable. So there's no point, giving people power and then charging them the same thing they would charge you in the United States on a dollar tariff, right? So you have to really understand the nuances of that community. And what it also does in terms of the learning is that it allows something we always forget about, which is local currency debt and local currency funding. The people in Madagascar or in Sierra Leone or in Kenya, they're not paying in dollars, so we hedge everything with the dollar, right? And then something goes to the dollar, you're going back to, some poor woman who has a little stall and say, okay, can you pay 3 times your electricity bill? And we found that a lot during COVID, all the dynamics change. The other thing that, I'm particularly, I particularly want to push during my reign of sustainability at SE4 is just local developers, local African developers. Because we've also found out that for so many years they've been subcontractors to larger companies, and the space is so big. There's like 600 million people to power. There's space for international developers, local developers, state developers, but we do have to make that concerted effort for African developers. And it's something I take very seriously, and even when you're applying for the grant, there are some nuances there that allow local developers to get through, because they might not have 5 years audited accounts. They might not be lucky enough to have done their Series A, B, C. All those things that people just assume. No, but they are still very capable. They understand the space a lot, and we do have to, and we have to develop that African ecosystem. So that is what we're doing. So we've powered this first community in Madagascar. The next one's going to be in Sierra Leone, I believe, and then in Benin.
Okay.
And then we've just opened one in my country, Nigeria, but that's for productive use. And that, again, is very exciting because that's for SMEs. And one of the outcomes of that is that the SME employs one other person.
Yeah.
The job creation and the whole GDP growth thing is something that's very exciting.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question is, do you think that Madagascar project can be replicated? And it sounds like it already is.
Yes. But you have to look at the different localities as well. So if I was going to do a project in Kenya, it will probably be standalone system for productive uses. And this would probably go into agriculture, solar irrigation and things like that. So you can't, again, I know, and I'm harping on Africa, that's not all we do. We do stuff in Asia as well. But we can't look at a country and a continent and say, this is the one solution. You don't only have to look at countries in specific ways. You have to look at the states you're going into, because they're huge, and they also, and I think that's the issue, kind of localizing some of our solutions so they really thrive. I think we've made mistakes on this worked in Nigeria, so of course it's going to work in South Africa. So of course it doesn't happen in real life. So we spent a lot of time analyzing and also getting the government support to implement any of these programs. That's also very, very important, because it drives the enabling environment for the developer.
Martin, optimistic on what Damilola was talking about here?
I think if we do what she wants, everything will be fine.
So that's it.
I think Damilola is just demonstrating practicality and ambition. And I think our job, the rest of us who are either at a more political space, is how to align our political process to those practical outcomes. The truth is, I am optimistic about, first, yes, your role is global, but I'm very optimistic about a generation of Africans who are really looking to push the envelope in Africa. And in Kenya itself, between what the government has done in terms of electricity access, in terms of infrastructure, etc., beside that, there's a lot of social and business innovation going on. So I am optimistic. If I sound pessimistic, it's because I think we are inadequately supporting these innovators and actors on the ground.
I mean,
I agree.
Okay. You want to add anything to that? Or
I think there's just, unfortunately, there's this perception of risk going into the African continent that's just not right. There's this perception that if I do this and it fails here, everything goes wrong. But there's not the perception of just how much opportunity there is when things go right. It's probably one of the few continents that you can get double-digit, interest or profit back. And, there are a lot of people doing some amazing things, and they happen to be, very, very young Africans. So that is all I would add to that, come in, understand the space. If you need any guidance, contact us. And, it's really, really important to invest in the space and understand the opportunity as well. It's not just an aid and grant project. There's actually money to be made in the space.
I want to follow up about that, but first I want to bring in David Nabarro, again, co-director, Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. David, just to thank you again for joining us this morning, but if you have any initial thoughts on some of the challenges and opportunities for the fuel, food, and finance issues that we're facing today.
Thank you very much. First of all, what a joy to hear Damilola Ogunbiyi and His Excellency, the Ambassador, talking about the issues as they see them. I'd just say that I agree from the perspective of food systems and health, the issues that have been identified are right. The future of development in Africa, or indeed in all low and middle income countries is not aid from the West. It is support for the build-up of capacity within country. We can accompany, but we should not see ourselves in any way as more than supporters. After all, we're not exactly, in many higher income countries, doing brilliantly right now. But if we look around the world, there is a major food crisis happening, and that's leading to a lot of people unable to purchase the food that they need for good nutrition through the money that they have in their pocket. That's because costs are rising and also the purchasing power of the shillings or rupees in their pocket is reducing. So what does that mean? It means that there are tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people in our world who are just getting poorer at breakneck speed. It's a big slide into poverty. A lot of the gains that were made in the last 25 years through concerted efforts by many national governments are just slipping away out of our grasp. People getting poorer quickly is a terrible situation. It leads to hundreds of millions of people in difficulty and millions of people actually probably getting into extreme challenges with major food shortages. Do you know there have been 5 consecutive rain failures in the northeast of Africa because of climate change? And what that's doing is just making it virtually impossible for households to build up any kind of storage in their homes, and they are unable to get the food they need. So we're anticipating that more people than ever are going to become food insecure and hungry in the coming weeks, unless the world can turn on the most extraordinary collective operation. This will be the biggest and most serious food crisis we've known. But it's not just that. Just quickly, I want to say farmers can't get the fertilizer they need to plant their fields when the rains do come. And they are also having to pay an awful lot to get their produce to market. So there's a real challenge for small scale farmers all over the world. There are 500 million of them, and a big chunk of them are likely to go out of business, together with the companies, the small companies that support them. Finally, just to say, who's going to be hurt as a result of all this? Answer: women and children. That's what always happens when times get bad, especially in poorer households. But we are very concerned that we're going to see a big increase in child malnutrition, which has many, many years of impact on their well-being over time. Thanks very much.
So, David, where are the opportunities? Where do you see, as the UN is gathering next week, where are there opportunities for multilateral benefits?
There are fantastic opportunities all over all regions. Last week being with many governments and those who support them in Africa, looking at food systems. No problem at all to find many young people who want to get into chicken rearing or better production of vegetables and grains, but they need investment. And the investment resources are insufficient, and that means that the opportunity requires the arrival of more capital within the bank accounts of national governments. Now, if, as Ambassador said, they've got very tight fiscal space in their finance ministry budgets, they're not able to support the longer term investment by farmers. And at the same time, they've got to try to find the resources to provide relief and social protection. So there's plenty of opportunity. There's lots of good soil and opportunity for energy production and great markets for food all over the world. But it's the cash for investment that's difficult, and many countries just in really tight situation, partly because of debt and partly because their fiscal headroom is so narrow. It means expanding the funds available to poor countries. That means a generous approach to financing from the governors of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which are the rich nations of the world.
Thank you, David. Damilola, Martin, question for you. We've talked about the IMF, World Bank, other multilateral financing opportunities. What about Wall Street banks. We write a lot about how the global banking community is trying to build its sustainability efforts, and they are looking at opportunities to do project finance. Do you see opportunities, partnerships, funding from the Wall Street crowd?
Yeah, I have to be careful for this. Of course, there's the opportunity. It's if they're interested. So most of these institutions, they find countries like Indonesia and India risky. So if countries that are they're risky, the likelihood they come into the real developing countries and the SIDS it's lacking, and it is very, very hard even within those institutions to find like a proper Africa desk. You know, I've tried. You know, who's your focal point on this? You know, it's extremely difficult. So, yes, there's opportunity, but they have to want to do it. You know, you can push, you can advocate, but they have to want to do it. So that's the challenge that I found with Wall Street.
Martin?
Well, I can't speak for Wall Street, but I do know that at a time of crisis, the tendency of capital is to move to what it perceives to be safety,
Right.
which is essentially to move out of, quote, emerging markets and back into more developed markets, especially when interest rates are rising in the richest part of the world. There's more of an incentive to come back here. And
Yes.
that landscape of risk and geopolitical risk is foremost in the minds of a lot of people. Part of the opportunity, I think, is that the geopolitical risks and the pandemic risks and the pandemic realities we just faced have made a lot more companies start to think about how to shift their supply and production
Yes.
chains. And so there are companies that will feel that even in the older model, it was cost and efficiency that predominated in where you located your production and your supplies. Now there's an added layer of risk from geopolitics. And COVID made a lot of people aware that their countries, as rich and technologically advanced as they were, don't produce masks, don't produce the basics needed in hospitals.
Right.
There's an opportunity for some of that recasting of supply chains and production chains to touch on other regions. So I think there's no reason why you should not consider Kenya or Ghana or Botswana or South Africa to shift some of your manufacturing out of certain parts of the world to Kenya and et cetera. So there's that opportunity, which I think is an opportunity that would need to be financed, but not financing Kenya, but financing a large multinational to shift some of its supply chains to Kenya. Away from that reshifting of production, which I think is a very real opportunity for job creation and wealth creation, is the fact that a lot more of the private money will need to follow government money.
Yes.
So if you saw the Biden administration, there's an ambition to bring together the different development funds within the US government and direct. The next step now is to put enough people, enough expertise in those bodies so that they are able to respond to her projects.
Yes.
The projects are there, the people who are doing are there, but now it is the US, the UK, and other different countries that have development funding of one kind or another to respond. And if they do that, then the private money may be able to see the opportunity. If they do more of the de-risking of that private money, more of it may flow. Finally, African governments, and I think even the private sector, need to do more in the data space in terms of clarifying what this risk of investing in Africa is. A lot of it's like, my thinking, or at least my experience, is that investors are willing to take a spectrum of risks. There are those who are the most conservative to some who take a lot of risks in return for a lot of return. What they don't like is lack of a number to the risk.
Right. Yeah.
Right? because then you're blind. You don't know if it's a high-risk investment or a low-risk investment. It's just so we need to actually put data to the risk, and then you will find perhaps even investors that you had never traditionally expected to come into Africa ready to do so. There's a lot of work to do there in terms of data, in terms of availing that data in public, and in terms of making that data of high enough quality to make decisions with on Wall Street.
That's a really great point. David, any other thoughts on this about how to get more sort of the financial markets involved?
What a great conversation. Again, if we look at agriculture and food, one of the most important findings to come out of the COVID outbreaks and also the current crisis, mostly triggered by climate change and conflict, is that systems have just got to be more resilient. That's a word that is now more and more being used. I think at the beginning, people worried that it was perhaps meaning a little bit of a slowdown on growth, just go for resilience. But after we've seen what COVID did, people are turning around and looking at each other and saying, we can't be sitting in a situation where our supply chains can so easily get blocked, or our producers find that their markets are completely broken. So the need for resilience is there on food, and that means more local production, less reliance on imports, less reliance on what comes from far away. And that means shorter and more agile supply chains. And the only way to get that is through the mingling of public and private finance. If I had one big request, that is just for more agriculture-based lending by banks that know a bit about the kind of terms under which you have to lend if you're trying to bring farmers more in. It's not quite the same as other kinds of lending. We need more of it. And I agree totally with His Excellency that the combination of data, analysis, and connectivity is key to making these things work. If you want agile supply chains, connect the consumer with the producer and make certain that there are people to interpret in the middle. Thanks again.
Martin, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick appeal.
Yes.
When we talk about the just energy transition, we're going to also need to talk more and act more on a just fertilizer and agricultural transition, in the sense that Africa needs to produce more fertilizer for itself. Being a net importer of so much fertilizer is really not a sustainable way to undertake agriculture. As David said, farmers are waiting for fertilizer and it's getting more expensive. In Kenya, the government is having to step in to stabilize those prices and to give relief to farmers and try and provide cheaper fertilizer. But we need it to get even cheaper. Now, there is a part of the environmental lobby that is seeking climate change action that pushes back on increased fertilizer production, increased refining in Africa. And I think I get the overall desire to respond to the climate crisis, which is very real. But it's really important that the proposals that are being made for supporting fertilizer production in Africa to be supported and not to be seen as a threat to climate change mitigation or adaptation. Africans need food cheap. And lastly, I'll just say something about, as a member of the Security Council, when countries have populations that use more than 50% of their earnings for food, that is a key part of fragility, political fragility. So we have to solve this not just from the developmental perspective, but as a peace and security matter. If the prevention agenda really is a real agenda in the United Nations, then we can begin with food prices as a key indicator of, I think, a leading indicator of the prospects for stability, peace, and security. And finally, there's some actors. I keep saying finally, sorry.
No, that's okay, please. This is
There's some actors.
very valuable.
There's a bank called Afri-Exim Bank. And I have just noticed, I don't know anyone.
What was it called again? Sorry.
Afri-Exim Bank.
The Africa XM Bank.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
I've noticed, without knowing much, that a lot of the innovative projects going on, a lot of the aggressive, bold projects going on, you get to hear the word Afri-Exim Bank. And it tells me that institutions with the imagination and the desire to engage can do a lot to change the picture as it stands.
Excellent. Excellent. I had one question for you, Damilola, but did you have anything you wanted to follow up on from what Mark was saying?
I just wanted to add that I think we have to understand that the energy transition is different for every single country, and it has to be just and it has to be equitable. It's not okay to say one side of the world do something when another side of the world is not doing that. And even in the case of fertilizers, I think the fertilizer we're even producing now on continent is being shipped out.
Okay.
Right? Because it's the highest bidder, and I understand that it's a private sector game, but we need to understand that a lot of things that we produce is also being sent out that is needed on continent. So when we talk about the just energy transition, this is where the piece on data is very key, is what does it actually take to be climate development and energy and this, food secure all in one package instead of saying one instead of the other, right? Because again, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, if you take away South Africa from the equation, it's probably less than 1% of global emissions. For me, it's quite crazy, like that's the place you start with your climate crisis, and we do have to understand that. So again, 1 billion people develop out of poverty, you're going to use a bit more carbon. But that means the rest of the world has to use less carbon. And sometimes, it really triggers me where we're choosing between climate and development.
Right.
We cannot do that. We have to have both in the equation. And it means that people who use a lot more have to use less to make sure Africa actually develops.
Can I ask, and just very briefly, because we have a couple questions from the audience, but voluntary carbon market, you mentioned that before. Yes. It's something that we're just starting. We were discussing, I've never heard of it 6 months ago. What is that, and what might your role be in facilitating that?
Okay, so what we're trying to develop is what would be the framework for a proper voluntary carbon market on the continent. Right now, probably Kenya is responsible for about 25% of the carbon that is actually traded. But even the cost and that Kenya carbon, I don't want to get too technical, per ton gets is less than other countries, which is just not right. Mm-hmm. So understanding a quality standard that and I think most of it is the Kenyan cook stoves, that I think even some big high-end companies here buy from. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to say is that, the people who buy carbon credits, the deltas, the airlines, right, and everything, what are you looking for? And what are the co-benefits? Because the difference with typical African carbon credits is that when you give somebody solar power, you're probably displacing a diesel genset as well, and you're giving them a better quality of life. So that's also a very important part. And I just want to touch on those issues, that the archetypes in the carbon market right now are not developed for the African market. One of the big transition in the African market is transition out of diesel and petrol gensets, of which there are about 100 million of it, and it's just as harmful as coal, basically. So, but there's no archetype of what happens in the carbon space if you displace that. So we're also challenging and saying that we need to have space for new types of carbon. So this work is going on over the next 3-4 months, and it'll be great to come back and
Excellent.
touch. And we're also getting African leadership also interested in channeling that, so we have something to present by COP27.
Excellent. A couple questions from the audience, very much related to technology opportunities. One on low-tech approaches like the cooking you mentioned. Solar cooking, how can that be used to reduce cooking-related female mortality?
I mean, electric cooking is just as effective as LPG. Mm-hmm. But what people need to understand is the cost of electric cooking. If someone doesn't have electricity at all, do you wait for electricity or do you give them something transitional? But we are testing a lot of different kind of electric cook stoves. I mean, I have some in my house. Everything I do is electric because I run on gas in America, which again is that's something that bothers me. That okay, it's probably the first time I'm actually cooking on gas in New York. So yeah, electric cook stoves are big, but we do have to get the cost down for everybody to afford it, and we have to also look at electricity and cooking programs as one. So when you are giving someone electricity, they're not still using fuel wood.
Right.
You are thinking of, oh, how do you take up the entire energy need? And that, I think, is something that's going to jump out in the next few months, even with the development finance institutions.
Martin, similar question. Technology opportunities that you're seeing, thinking about, hopeful about?
What she said.
Okay.
No, look, in terms of technology opportunities, I think the Kenyan technology space is a very promising space. There's a lot. What I'd like to concentrate on just for a second is like wastewater management, right? You have increasingly, just like the energy kind of becoming a decentralized grid, even management of waste is also going to become decentralized. There's a lot of opportunity to build out the technology in Africa and many parts of Asia, India, for instance. But there's a need for a financing model that allows people to have adequate wastewater management, and then the domino effects on public health. The domino effects on addressing water scarcity, which is a very real problem, in the Horn of Africa, and again, that comes back down to the business model and the need for capital to build out that decentralized infrastructure. The technology is there. There's still some innovation to be done, but that lack of investment in that space makes it very difficult to build up that business model that then allows you to go household to household.
I just wanted to add that Kenya is actually leading the way in terms of financial clean tech with M-Pesa. You know,
the M-Pesa, sorry, just define that for folks in the audience.
Oh, how do I describe M-Pesa?
It's mobile money.
It's mobile money, but it's gone on steroids now. They can offer money for commodities. They can offer money for. I think they're the first people to have meters on even LPG canisters, which is quite innovative and reduces waste. But why it's so important was that it also adds the digitalization angle. Right. Again, so if you give people energy and then you can give them, access to the internet, and you give it all at the same time, and it's paid by a single platform, that platform is also worth a lot. Yeah. So, and it's really the Kenyan model that not only happening in Africa, but parts of Asia and around the world are really looking at it and say, how can we replicate this? So there's a lot of innovation going on in Kenya right now.
David, any thoughts about this technology opportunities?
Totally. I think we're all agreed. Mm-hmm. The technology is just there that enables things to happen at a different speed and in a different way compared with, for example, what might have happened in my own country, the UK. I just say two other things. The incentives are changing. Again, Ambassador said, His Excellency, where remarks were, there ought to be more fertilizer production in Africa. I predict there will be an enormous upsurge in fertilizer production within the continent because of the high cost of production in Europe because of the rise in gas prices. Secondly, I think that there's also going to be a lot of interest in new processes for fertilizer production, including green ammonia. That's ammonia made through sustainable energy, and that will grow very, very fast indeed. So just to say that anybody who's listening and watching, who's got finance that they wish to invest, I would say that energy and food in many African countries, many developing countries, represents an extraordinary investment opportunity with medium-term high returns. And this is likely to be something that will be a sort of crowd-in effect in the coming months and years if the incentives stay as they are right now. Thanks for the chance to be with you. I'm slipping off now.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David. And I think we are out of time for this panel. So, David, thank you again. Damilola, Martin, thanks so much for participating this morning.
Thank you for having us.